Okay then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 138. I am your host, pannobhasa, and those fishes and snails back there are your co-hosts. And we've got kind of a moderately large number of questions, so we might be going about 3 hours on this one. I don't know why I bothered to say this, because you guys can just look down at the time bar underneath and see how long it's going to last. I do not have that luxury. That's one advantage you have over me. And so I'm just going to grasp my beverage, remove the little paper umbrella, signifying my sophistication and style, throw it onto the table, take a sip, and commence to answer questions. And the first question is from Raphael. And Raphael says, would you say that walking barefoot has a positive effect since you have experienced it for a long time? And it is true that when I was a monk, there were times when I was in Burma, especially, when I would wear shoes maybe twice a year. If it became necessary to wear shoes because of like thorns on the ground or something, I might have to wear shoes, but usually I went barefoot. And there's definitely a positive effect of going barefoot. The main positive effect, especially for a practicing Buddhist or someone who's practicing in any kind of spiritual tradition, is that it requires you to be mindful. You've got to be careful about how you walk and where you walk. You always have to be aware of where you're going to be stepping, because especially like in tropical Asia, you can step not only on thorns and just sharp pointy rocks and so forth, you can step on snakes or scorpions or centipedes or even ant highways. So going barefoot definitely makes you more aware of the walking process and just more mindful of your surroundings in general, especially your lower surroundings. So it's definitely good. And one thing I noticed when I've been going barefoot for a while is possibly all of us, except for a few mutants, have these latent barefoot instincts because our ancestors went barefoot. And so we've got like these latent instincts with regard to how to walk barefoot. My father, when I was a kid, told me that like the natives in Africa have the soles of their feet as tough as shoe leather because they go barefoot all the time. So I assumed when I started going barefoot, my feet would really get tough. And although they got a bit calloused, they never really got that tough. And so mainly when you go barefoot, you just learn how to walk barefoot. And a lot of it is like relearning just from these latent barefoot instincts coming up to the conscious level, or coming up to enough of the conscious level that you're aware that they really are like conditioning how you walk. So I guess I answered that question. That's the main benefit, is it just improves your mindfulness when you're walking. Makes you more alert with regard to where you're going. So I'm just going to move on to the second question, which is from Newman. And it's like adding to the previous question. He says, did you never get foot infections from walking bare feet everywhere? And I never got foot infections, although I did step on thorns sometimes. I remember one famous occasion. I was walking for alms in, Pindale village in central Burma, and I stepped on, it was either a cactus thorn or a really wicked acacia thorn. Some of those acacia thorns get like 2 inches long, and it went all the way up into my heel and broke off in there. And I had to walk like 2 miles, like finish my alms round and then walk all the way back. And I could not get the tip of that thorn out of my heel. And a lay supporter like sent a doctor to me, And because they were trying to force me against my will to get like a tetanus shot and this kind of stuff, I just refused to let the doctor treat me, which caused him to be somewhat disgusted with the whole situation. And I was just like trying to like squeeze it out and so forth until finally it just festered out. It was like I was squeezing it just mainly to get like icky fluids out. I mean, wasn't even for sure that there was something broken off in there other than just the fact that it wasn't healing up. And then it just popped out. It was like a 1/4 inch long tip of a thorn that had been in my heel for like at least a week at that time. But I never really got any kind of foot infections. Never got athlete's foot, mainly because when you're going barefoot, you got better air circulation. Your feet can dry out better, that kind of thing. I got cracked feet a lot. Like, especially during the hot season, the dry season, when you're walking in like sand and dust, then your heels will start to crack. And that was a problem like in ancient times. In the Visuddhimagga, it talks about how the Sri Lankan monks of Buddhaghosa's time would carry around a little tube of oil, mainly just for rubbing it into their feet, probably because their heels are cracking from just drying out. Like the skin of your feet, the soles of your feet just dries out from walking in sand and dust, just parched, hot. So it was just a thing that was continually being contended with by monks who walked around barefoot. And let's see, I mean, you'd think that I'd get some kind of foot infections, considering some of the places where I walked barefoot. Some of the scariest places I walked barefoot were like public restrooms at bus stations in Burma, which are pretty, I mean, you're like walking through like puddles of who the hell knows what, that kind of stuff. So often, I mean, if I was riding a bus and the bus stopped at some place that had like some trees over to one side, rather than go into the public restroom, I just go off behind a tree or something somewhere. But I never really got any kind of like septic foot infections, other than maybe a little bit of infection, like like a thorn or something in my foot. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, if you could only have one species of fish for the rest of your life, which would you choose? And he's referring to aquarium fish and not like for eating. And this is really kind of a more difficult question than one would expect, because my approach to keeping an aquarium is that it's like a balanced ecosystem. And so you've got various niches that different kinds of fish would have to fit into. Like, you need a scavenger fish that's eating stuff off the bottom. You need algae eaters. That would be, the most basic for maintaining a healthy aquarium is, I could have snails or shrimp or something eating the algae, but still you need, one of the most basic kinds of fish you need for an aquarium is a scavenger, something that eats off the stuff off the bottom, like decaying plant matter and that kind of stuff. So with that in mind, it might be that if I could only keep one species of aquarium fish, it might be like a Siamese algae eater, like Rama the First in that tank back there, which is just a plain kind of brown looking fish. It's not a pretty fish particularly. It's got a nice streamlined shape and everything. But, it'll eat anything. It eats algae. It eats derbis off the bottom, decaying plant material. It'll eat minced clams. It'll eat anything. So maybe a Siamese algae eater, although it'd be kind of strange to have an aquarium that only has like Siamese algae eaters in it. The other option that I was thinking of would be to get a kind of fish that pretty much has to be by itself anyway. It's kind of fish that I've never kept before, like a Senegal bitch ear, which is, they get like 2 feet long, and they look like a dragon. They're a very archaic, primitive kind of fish, sort of like a sturgeon is a primitive kind of fish. And they're just really cool looking. So I might just wind up getting like one of those, but still there'd be problems with algae. I mean, maybe I could get snails that the bitch ear wouldn't eat. But aside from that, I'd just be screwed. And so it might really be that if I only kept one species of fish, it would have to be like a Siamese algae eater. Maybe I could get like a little school of them because they are a schooling fish. So, I think I'm just going to move on to Philalethes' second question, which is as follows. Could a Buddhist believe in soul? This is different from self or ego. Actually, according to Ken Wheeler, the Buddha taught about a soul outside of the aggregates to be freed from karma. Well, I mean, Ken Wheeler declares himself to be the world's foremost authority on early Buddhism. But if anyone who knows Pali, who reads his translation, sees that he really doesn't know what he's doing, that he just makes these wildly inaccurate translations. And so really, I mean, I've read the text fairly carefully, and I know the Buddha did not teach that there is a soul outside the aggregates. So, I mean, there are Buddhists who believe in a soul, especially Western Buddhists. Buddhists of European ancestry seem to be the most vehement in the existence of some kind of eternal soul. And if you're going to take like an Upanishadic approach where you're saying that just reality is our soul, like Brahman or capital G God is our soul. It's like the absolute pervades the entire universe, and that aspect of the absolute that is pervading us could be called our soul, and you reify it, which early Buddhists didn't do, but then you can sort of put forth a heretical but nevertheless sort of plausible argument that we do have a soul, but it's like all the beings on the entire universe are sharing the same single soul, because that soul is just the Dharmakaya, going with like Mahayana Buddhist terminology, or it's God going with Christian terminology. So let's see. So some Buddhists definitely believe in soul. They might be heretical Buddhists or like Pure Land Buddhists or something. But I mean, obviously there are Buddhists who are very sincere in their Buddhism who do believe in a soul. But the whole idea that the Buddha did teach that there's a soul outside the aggregates, I mean, there really is no evidence for that. That what they do is, like, the Buddha says none of the five aggregates is the self. And they say, well, I mean, there could be something outside the aggregates. The Buddha didn't say it, not in the text anyway, but, they say, well, I mean, there's still like this loophole. There's like this open doorway where you can say, well, something outside of the five aggregates is the soul. But I mean, there are suttas where the Buddha says the all is the five aggregates. This entire cosmos is five aggregates. There's nothing beyond the five aggregates in samsara. So then they say, well, that means there could be a soul that isn't samsaric. It's outside of samsara. But the thing is, in early Buddhism especially, you do your best to avoid reifying the absolute. You try to avoid reifying the highest reality, ultimate reality. That anything you say about it is going to be invalid. So the best thing to do is just shut up about it. That you practice in order to like realize it, so that you're not just theorizing about it. But I mean, until you do that, all you're doing is theorizing about it, and all the theories are going to be invalid because it's just completely off the scale and no words can really touch it. I mean, like some people, like the Zen saying is words are just a finger pointing at the moon, but the ultimate, the absolute, isn't in any direction. You can't even point in that direction. So, I mean, there's always going to be Buddhists, especially some Western Buddhists, who just vehemently, sometimes angrily insist that the Buddha taught that there is an eternal soul, even though there's no mention of it in the text unless you're like Ken Wheeler and just mistranslate stuff. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. Also from Philalethes, which is as follows. If tomorrow all your books were to burn down and you could only keep one book, which would it be and why? Well, probably, let's see here. Can you see it? It's like the blue one, the pale blue big one on the top shelf in the middle there. Is that right? Yeah, it's like dead center in that top shelf, that big blue one. That's my Poly-English dictionary. And the reason why I would keep that one is because it's really irreplaceable, because as a monk, I spent probably hundreds of hours supplementing that dictionary, just adding more definitions and additional, like more words, more poly words that just aren't in the book, and just like alternative definitions that aren't in the book, that sort of thing. So that book would be irreplaceable. Most of the other books are either replaceable or not that important, so that even if I couldn't replace it, it wouldn't be a major loss. But my Poly-English dictionary is one of a kind, I think. So I think I've successfully answered all three of Philalethes' questions. So I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid. And Thermal Squid says, feelings about medicinal cannabis when used authentically and not as an excuse to get wasted? Question mark. So this is a question. But then Thermal Squid has like this little paragraph of commentary, which goes, I recently got a medical card in Florida for ceaseless gastrointestinal problems that have in the past inspired me to do some not so wholesome things to cope with the pain. I notice it allows me to foster and sustain more wholesome mental states and prevents negative rumination. Would you think that there is demerit involved in something like this? Well, like I usually say with regard to Buddhist ethics, there's merit and demerit to almost any action we do. It's not like an Abrahamic religion or a religious system and a religious system of ethics where something is either right or wrong, black or white. I mean, in Buddhism, almost everything is a shade of gray. So, there is that. But getting back to the question here, feelings about medicinal cannabis when used authentically and not as an excuse to get wasted. Well, even Buddhist monks were allowed to use cannabis medicinally. In fact, there's even a rule allowing monks to carry a little pipe for inhaling the fumes of burning medicines. So, if it was okay for ancient Indian monks, that's a pretty good indication that it would be okay for postmodern Western lay people. And sometimes as a monk, I did smoke some cannabis. Every once in a while, it was always people like Western people who would give it to me. And for Western people, even spiritually oriented Western people, to smoke some weed every now and then is fairly common, actually. And I have had some like really profound experiences under the influence of cannabis. Like there was one time I was on the banks of the Irrawaddy River and somebody offered me some cannabis. So I smoked this cannabis and I'm kind of looking around, see if anyone's watching me, sort of like if you're in high school, like smoking weed during like lunch break, you're looking around, see if anyone's seeing you, that kind of thing. And I was having some really deep insights that were triggered just from being high as I was like doing walking meditation on the bank of the Irrawaddy River near Pagan, the ancient capital of Burma. So, cannabis, it can cause a kind of euphoria, which isn't necessarily bad from a Buddhist point of view. Like if you're stressed out, just being stressed out is technically immoral. Just to be unhappy it's like, I don't know how else to say. I mean, it is immoral. You're inflicting unhappiness upon yourself because suffering is always self-inflicted, ultimately, from a Buddhist philosophical point of view, which is something leftist Buddhists in the West don't like to deal with because they want to blame evil whitey and white patriarchy and all this. But really, all suffering is ultimately self-inflicted. It is a choice, even though most of us are too subconscious to realize that there is a choice. But it is volitional. And so, I mean, a little bit of euphoria, when you're all stressed out, it just helps to calm you down. I mean, that in itself is beneficial. And then also, I mean, you can get more spiritual. For me, cannabis doesn't really like expand consciousness so much. Sort of like something like psilocybin mushrooms can like expand consciousness. Cannabis doesn't do that so much. It just kind of shifts consciousness into like a different mode. And I mean, just to experience that, I mean, if you're not doing it just to party, to escape from a reality that you don't like very much, that kind of thing, but just it helps you to triangulate. You know, you can look at reality from different aspects, from different perspectives. And in a way that can help you, it can lead to insight. Sort of like living in a very non-Western culture for some period of time also gives you a certain amount of perspective. Like if you're just living in the same culture your entire life, then you can be very culturally conditioned. Everyone around you is just as culturally conditioned in the same way as you. And so you don't notice it. You know, you're just right in the middle of it. You got nothing to compare it with. But then you go to like Burma and live there for 20 something years. And you can see that, I mean, it was like, I mentioned this before. When I went to Burma, it really struck me how culturally conditioned the Burmese were without realizing it. They had no idea that they were culturally conditioned. You could tell them and it just, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. But then after I came back to America, it was just as striking how culturally conditioned Americans are without them realizing it. So getting high on cannabis, you know, stay away from narcotics, you know, anything that's really addictive. I mean, you're best avoiding that. A certain amount of cannabis, I don't think, I mean, it's not as bad as alcohol, in my opinion, overall, with regard to its effects. So, yeah, I really don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to smoke a certain amount of cannabis, unless you're like some Jamaican who's smoking like 3 ounces of it per a day. Something like that is rather excessive and it's not good for your lungs and all that. But a small amount, maybe even like in something edible so that you're not even inhaling smoke and that kind of thing. Yeah, every once in a while to just like knock you out of a rut, give you like an alternative perspective. Also, it does have kind of this weird dharmic side effect of just sort of like really almost disabling my short-term memory so that you're in the present moment more efficiently than if you're not high on cannabis. Or at least it works that way for me. It makes me more in the present moment, partly because short-term memory is just kasplooey. So, I think I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's second question, which is recommendations on right livelihood for someone who is likely going to remain as a layman. Question mark. And then he's got the little paragraph, a commentarial paragraph. I think that wrong livelihood extends just beyond poisons, intoxicants, meat, weapons, and slavery, and that things like insurance, sales, modern medicine, sex work of any kind, gambling, and most enforcement agencies also apply. That is actually extremely rare to have a blameless occupation. Yeah, just to get right livelihood from the Buddhist point of view, like just a cashier at a grocery store technically would not be a right livelihood because she's going to be selling cans of bug spray. She's going to be selling beer. You know, she's going to be selling the stuff that you're not supposed to sell if you're practicing right livelihood. Also, just like a waitress at a restaurant, if she is supplying alcoholic beverages to people who are ordering them, again, you're not supposed to do that. I mean, she's like a drug dealer in that sense. But I mean, yeah, I mean, so long as your livelihood isn't really causing harm to people, especially in sort of the outward sense, I mean, just causing someone to get upset because they get upset really easy and you haven't necessarily done anything with ill intent, you can set those kind of scenarios aside. There's always going to be someone who disapproves of you no matter what you do or don't do. But to have like a harmless vocation would be right livelihood from a Buddhist point of view that doesn't require dishonesty, for example. And I mean, dishonesty in business, they've got it down to a science, I think. So, I mean, if you've got a job interview and they're thinking about hiring you for some relatively important position in some kind of capitalistic business, it'd probably be good to be upfront and like caution the person that you are scrupulously honest and are not going to tell lies for the sake of making money, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, so long as the job is like not causing harm to anybody and is an honest job, it does not require any kind of deceit, anything like that, I think you'll be doing okay. But yeah, sex work, gambling, that kind of thing would also be out. Like pandering to other people's addictions is probably best not to do that. It's sort of a fine line, though. I mean, you're never going to have pure saintliness as a layperson. It's hard to even do it as a monk who renounces society and goes off and lives alone in a forest. Still, he's going to be doing unwholesome things, even just believing himself to exist for a few minutes. Well, he's wallowing in delusion. Getting angry at the fly that just bit you. Even though you don't slap it, still, you little bastard. There you go. You've wallowed in aversion. So, yeah, I think just so long as you're honest and not selling stuff that hurts people, or like even like a chef who's catering to like obese foodies. I mean, that's sort of like a drug dealer right there. So yeah, I mean, you got to use your better judgment. You just got to feel into it and see, I mean, is this like harming people? Is it harming myself? Is it harming others? And if it isn't, except in these really subtle ways that you just can't escape from, then I think you're doing okay. And so I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's third question. Is homosexuality always sexual misconduct? And his commentary here is, this is an icky question, but I really wonder about it sometimes. I feel like it is somewhat of a paraphilia or developmental disorder, if not outright unnatural. But I also don't know how one should treat it as a political or larger social level. At a political or larger social level, I seem to go back and forth between aversion and ambivalence toward it, and do not understand how to manage its prevalence in terms of attitude and right thinking. And I mean, just for starters, any sexuality is to some degree immoral from a Buddhist point of view. That, like desire is the cause of all suffering, and sex, it's associated with some of the strongest desires that we experience. Just wallowing in sensuality, like sex, especially good sex, is about as wallowy in sensuality as you can get. So, I mean, that's not the same as breaking the third precept, though. The third precept is sensual misconduct. Kamesu michachara. And homosexuality really was not an issue. If you read the text, there's really not much of an issue. I mean, like men resorting to bathhouse eunuchs is like a sign of bad character. There's hardly, I can't even recall any mention of two grown men having sex with each other that's described in the text or even in the commentary literature. It was like in ancient India, the Ganges Valley, men with that kind of disposition would resort to, as I just said, bathhouse eunuchs, that sort of thing. So it's kind of a gray zone. It's not really spelled out very clearly in the texts. At least I do not recall it. I've studied the text fairly comprehensively, and I do not recall ever coming across this issue in the text. There's a lot of issues that Buddhism, especially like Pali Buddhism, just does not address, and this is the only one that's going to be mentioned in this Q&A, inshallah. So, I mean, if you consider that like sensual right conduct for a layperson is a monogamous, like faithful relationship, mainly for the sake of just maintaining society through a man and a woman coming together, raising children, propagating the human race, keeping society going, then homosexuality would be on the fringe of that. I mean, you could have like the loving monogamous thing going. Some homosexual men are capable of that. Although I did read in it was like a doctor's diagnostic manual. It was the Merck manual, I think. The Merck guide or the Merck manual. One of them is like a pharmacological thing, and the other one is like helping you to diagnose symptoms and so forth. And homosexuality was in the book as a kind of disorder. So it was a relatively old edition, I think. And it was saying, and it's true to this day, it's not unusual at all for a homosexual man to have had more than 1,000 sexual partners. So, I mean, there's kind of a tendency in that direction that is recognized in the texts, but it doesn't really spell it out. So, I mean, you could argue, especially in the West, that like two gay men who are faithful to each other, they love each other, they just, I mean, it's kind of a borderline case, and I think it could be argued either way. And whoever would be the better debater would win the debate. So, yeah. So I think I should just move on to the next one, because as I say, I mean, ultimately, the Buddhist texts really do not discuss this issue in any explicit way that I can recall. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Maitreya Buddha. And Maitreya Buddha says, according to Buddhist cosmology, or the 31 planes of existence, humans are in the Manusa Loka, or human realm, and animals are in the Kama Dugati Bhumi, or Apaya Bhumi, the planes of misery. Yeah, the four lower realms. One of the four lower realms is the animal realm. So why is that humans are able to perceive animals in the human realm with ayatana, or the five senses, despite humans and animals belonging to different realms or planes? Why is that we are only able to perceive animals but not any other beings from within the Kamasugati Bhumi and other planes from the Rupa Loka or Arupa Loka? Well, I mean, we wouldn't be able to perceive any being in the Arupa Loka because that's the formless realms. I mean, they're just so completely beyond us. And furthermore, there's no physical bodies to see. So it might be that an extremely advanced meditative adept could be aware of formless beings. But, I mean, the average guy is not going to be aware of such beings. With regard to the Brahma realm, the Rupa Loka, which is essentially Brahmas who have physical bodies, their physical bodies are so attenuated, so subtle. It's a different vibrational rate or whatever of matter. We can't see them either unless they want us to see them. Then they can sort of solidify themselves, slow down their vibrational rate or some such so that we can see them. But with regard to, there are terrestrial deities according to Buddhist, like, mythology, philosophy, whatever you want to call it, they're mentioned in the texts. It's the realm of the four great kings, which is one realm above human level on the 31 planes of existence. And we can see them at least sometimes. So, I mean, there's a lot of mention of people, seeing, like, I mean, ogres, the yaka belongs to this realm. And I mean, they eat people, supposedly. At least that's what the yaka kind of evolved into, like, with regard to the evolution of certain ideas with regard to non-human beings. But I mean, with regard to why we can see animals and animals can see us, I mean, we're living in the same kind of world. With regard to, like, the ghost realm, some people have seen ghosts. I apparently, like, at least when I was a little kid, was able to see spirits. Some people can see spirits. Some spirits can see us even. So, I mean, it's not just a matter of humans and animals can see each other, but any other planes, any other realms we can't see, because sometimes we can, at least. I mean, some animals we can't see, like the aptly named no-see-um, which is like a little insect that bites you. It's like a midge or something related to mosquitoes or gnats, I guess. And they're just so small that we can't see them, but they're still there. So what is the actual question here? Why is that humans are able to perceive animals in the human realm despite humans and animals belonging to different realms? Well, the whole realms thing was superimposed on this empirical reality. And so, I mean, you can't really argue against people and animals being able to see each other. I mean, that's just a given that had to be dealt with. And I mean, some other realms, they're just kind of mythological, I suppose. I mean, some of the realms on the 31 planes of existence, I'm rather skeptical of, to tell you the truth. And then, I mean, some realms are just so different from this realm that we just can't see each other. It's just too different of like psychology, and too different of like our environments and so forth. So let's see here. Yeah, it is true that the animals are considered to be in the lower realms, but I mean, technically, this is ancient Indian biology, so to speak, taxonomy. Whereas really, I mean, humans are animals. We are also technically a member of the animal realm, and I do not think that just putting all animals into the animal realm and humans in the human realm is, I mean, it's not good taxonomy, because a chimpanzee or even a dolphin comes closer to a human than it does to a mosquito. But like dolphins and mosquitoes are animal realm, we are human realm, and I just don't see it that way. A dog comes closer to a human than it does to a mosquito. So, I mean, some of this is just ancient Indian attempts at explaining things that modern Westerners really don't go along with very well. So, I kind of answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Kzen. And Kzen said, what is your view on Casina meditation? Saw an interesting interview where the practitioner talks about early Buddhist manuals mentioning the practice frequently. And then he left this under the recent YouTube video. And then somebody told him that I had already answered this question in Q&A number 135, was even kind enough to leave a timestamp. But Casina meditation, it was really a big deal, like when the Visuddhimagga was being written. Like the Visuddhimagga, the main meditation that it describes, all the 40, the 40 standard meditation techniques, but that are like traditional in Theravada Buddhism. But the main one that it gives the most detailed instructions on, most at length, is Casina meditation. So Casina meditation was probably a big deal like early medieval Sri Lanka at the very least. And there's still monks in Burma that practice Casina meditation, but it's rare. It's relatively rare. In Theravada Buddhism nowadays, certain meditations have just become predominant, especially meditation on breathing, anapanasati, like metta meditation, meditation on the 32 parts of the body, meditation on the 4 elements. Some Thai traditions use mantra, that kind of thing. And Casina is kind of obsolete, sort of. At least it's no longer nearly as much in fashion as it used to be. And there is a kind of hypnotic element to it. Like I mentioned, probably in Q&A 135, like the Stanford Hypnosis Lab, who they're trying to study hypnosis and hypnotic states scientifically. So they have to have like a standardized hypnotic technique. They got to hypnotize everyone the same way to reduce the variation, to strengthen their experimental designs and so forth. And the meditation technique at the Stanford Hypnosis Lab, at least at the time that I read the book written by the guy who worked there, is you look at a small disc on the wall. It was much smaller than the Casina disc. It could be just the head of a thumbtack stuck into the wall, but still you're just focusing on this disc in front of you, and you just kind of get absorbed into it. You become so focused on it, you become oblivious to other things, and then it has like this hypnotic effect. So I'm kind of ambivalent in my understanding of whether Casina is really something the Buddha originally taught and endorsed, or if it's something that kind of came into vogue because it had like spectacular results, because hypnosis can have spectacular results. A hypnotized person, especially if they're a good subject and in a deep hypnotic trance, they can do superhuman stuff, or just weird stuff that you would not expect. Like someone who's in a deep hypnotic trance, you can tell them that you're going to touch them with a red hot piece of iron. You just touch them with a regular pencil eraser, and still they will feel the pain and a blister will rise. They will literally get a 2nd-degree burn from just the belief that they got touched by something really hot. And then a lot of people know how you can someone who's in a hypnotic trance can just become stiff as a board, so that you can rest their head on the back of one chair, rest their feet on the back of another chair, and they're just like a plank going across, and you can put weights on them even, and they're fine. That kind of thing, which a person who's not in a trance, you generally don't do that. So, this one, Casina meditation, whether the Buddha originally taught it or whether it was just something that became fashionable because it had like dramatic effects and was more hypnotic than something more along the lines of expanded awareness, like expanded mindfulness, that kind of thing. I'm not 100% sure on that. It's been in Theravada Buddhism for a very long time. So if it is something that was added later, it was added later fairly early on. But the Visuddhimagga is it's like the central text in the Buddhist commentarial tradition, and it's got a heck of a lot to say about Casina meditation. So, yeah, I guess you could refer to the Q&A in 135 if you haven't already. And I'm just going to move on to Keizen's second question. Are Japanese prisons modeled after Zen monasteries? And I've never heard anything with regard to this. It could be because they're both Japanese, that they share a certain Japanese like strictness, stoicism, that kind of thing. But whether Zen or like Japanese prisons were deliberately modeled on Zen monasteries, I kind of doubt it. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in Zen monasteries that you don't see in Japanese prisons, I'm sure, and vice versa. So I'm rather doubtful of that. It could just be that they are both products of the same Japanese culture, and so they're going to have certain aspects that seem similar. But who knows? It may be that there was some reformer of the Japanese prison system back in the 1800s or something who deliberately modeled the new reformed prison system on the Zen monasteries, for all I know. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Quasitor. And this is a follow-up question to a previous question about formless realms. And Quasitor says, can an Arya be reborn into a formless realm if they cannot make any progress towards arahantship there? Well, an Anagami wouldn't be reborn into a formless realm. I don't think a Sakadagami would be reborn into a formless realm. An Arahant wouldn't be reborn at all. And so your only option, I think, would be a Sotapanna. And those of you who are familiar with my understanding of the 4 stages of sainthood or Aryahood will know that I consider it to be largely an academic issue. I don't think that the Buddha himself taught these 4 stages for various reasons that I've covered before. And so could a Sotapanna be reborn into a formless realm? I don't know if this is actually mentioned in the text. I assume it's possible. Presumably it'd be better if you could avoid being reborn into a formless realm, because as Quasitor indicates, you don't make any progress there. And I mean, it's extremely long-lasting lifetimes. This is like the most refined levels of samsara, that a lifespan is in the realm of billions of years. And so you're just going to be stuck in this bliss. I mean, it's bliss at least. It's not unpleasant. You're just stuck in this bliss, making no progress, just blissing out for billions of years. So I don't think there's any rules, or I don't know if there's any reason why a Sotapanna could not be reborn into a formless realm, but I've never really read anything one way or the other about Sotapannas. I mean, they could be reborn into a formless realm, I suppose, but they'd be better off if they didn't, just because it's going to postpone their enlightenment by billions of years. So I've been kind of not fully capable of answering quite a few of these questions so far, just because, I mean, some of them, I don't know how anybody could really answer them, and some, like whether Japanese prisons are based on Zen monasteries, it's just something I've never really heard about or read about or considered. So I'm just going to move on to Quasitor's second question, which is, if one were to meditate and develop equanimity and mindfulness to being tortured in hell, would they leave that realm pretty quickly? And I do think that the more like equanimity that you could muster in hell, the sooner you'd get out of there. I had this theory, like in Burma, during the hot weather in central Burma, and it was sort of like this insight. It was sort of like being in hell. You cannot escape from the heat. No electricity, no electric fans. And I mean, you just cannot get comfortable at all. You don't even stop sweating when you're taking a bath with well water, because the well water is warm. And so I had this idea. It's like, I mean, you just get into these just exasperated moods. I mean, people can just crack up from the heat. Anyone who's read a lot of Kipling or Somerset Maugham, who wrote about, you know, British colonialists in like India and Southeast Asia, they know, you know, people can just crack up. Like Kipling's At the End of the Passage has 2 guys that just go insane and die as a result of just this hellish heat day after day after day. You know, the temperature is like 115 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 or 2 months straight. No escape. So, I mean, it can just wear people down. Or The Outstation by Somerset Maugham is another example of people just cracking up because of the heat. So I had this little insight, though. It's taken me a long time to spit it out. But I had this insight that one of the reasons why hell lasts so long I mean, according to the Buddhists, you go to hell, you can be there for millions of years. And it doesn't make much sense. It's like, how are the bad things that a person does over the span of a few decades going to be punished fairly for millions of years? I mean, the Christians go even worse. It's like the bad deeds you do for a matter of just several decades at most. I mean, you're going to get punished forever. You're going to suffer torment forever. And that doesn't strike me as fair. That's not just. But I had this idea, like, once you go to hell, it's sort of like, it's even worse than being in central Burma during the hot season and then the subsequent rainy season, which is a drought and it doesn't rain. So it's just like a second hot season. You're in that, worse than that, for hundreds of years, thousands of years, tens, hundreds of thousands of years. It's like, it's just going to wear you down, and you're just going to start just raging against the world, cursing God in your heart, cursing the entire universe, just hating everything, because it has just worn you down until you just in this state of misery and just like radiating misery and just aversion in all directions. And that's what keeps you there. That was sort of this insight that I had. And I'm going to check, make sure we're really recording. Yep. We've been going for almost an hour already. How could we be going for almost an hour already? Man, I feel like I've only answered like 5 questions so far. This could be like an 8-hour long one. So yeah, I do think that if you're in hell, one thing that keeps you in hell for so long is you're just broken down mentally, and you're just hating yourself, you're hating God, you're hating everything, just overflowing with aversion, just due to the shitty situation that you have landed into. And so if you could cultivate equanimity, then that could be like the shortcut out. That if you could be mindful, just mindfully being tortured by demons, that kind of thing, mindfully just burning in the raging heat, glowing hot iron all around you, then yeah, if you get used to it and just kind of make peace with it somehow, you can just accept it to some degree, then I think that you would be out of there much more quickly. Because otherwise, how are you going to get punished for millions of years for something you did over the course of a few decades? And I'm just going to move on to the next question. Also from Quasator. Quasator says, is equanimity during discomfort considered paying back karmic debt in Buddhism, or is it more of a refraining of the mind resulting in a deeper insight into the mind's mental formations? Well, equanimity during discomfort, what it's doing, the main mechanism of how you're dealing with karma is that the paying back of a karmic debt is the Vedana. It's the feeling of what's happening to you now. So let's say it's really hot weather, so this discomfort from the really hot weather is paying back the karmic debt. But if you are reacting in aversion, you're making new karma. So you're just adding to the karmic debt. But if you have equanimity and detachment, then you're paying the karmic debt without adding more karma. So in a way, you're sort of defusing or neutralizing or denaturing this karma that's otherwise, you just have like a vicious circle. You have the unpleasant thing happen, you react with aversion, which makes more karma, which then comes back at you. You react with aversion, which makes more karma, which comes back at you. And so equanimity and detachment, mindful detachment, breaks that vicious circle. And it may be that you've got more and more karma that's sort of already like accumulated that's going to come at you, but you're not adding to it. And so gradually it's just going to fade away. That's the theory anyway. So let's see. I mean, it can be that you can get deeper insight into the nature of suffering, that kind of thing. That can happen too. But mainly just through equanimity, when bad things happen to you, is you're not just like perpetuating this vicious cycle of karmic retribution, like aversion for that karmic retribution, which makes more karma, which then comes back, and then you react against that, which makes more karma coming back, ad infinitum, if you let it happen that way. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Samana. And Samana says, you said pa-aukers are just hypnotizing themselves and thinking they are attaining some kind of jhanas. How would you explain hypnotizing from the Theravada Buddhist point of view? And I didn't really say that all pa-aukers are just hypnotizing themselves and thinking they're attaining some kind of jhana. I do specify that it's some people meditating at Pa'al or following the Pa'al method appear to be hypnotizing themselves and thinking that they're in jhana or having like clairvoyant visions and so forth, when really it's the product of hypnotic suggestion. I don't say that all people at Pa'al are just hypnotizing themselves, but I do think there's a lot of self-hypnosis going on at Pa'al. So the main question here, though, is how would you explain hypnotizing from a Theravada Buddhist point of view? And again, this is one of those issues, not the last one of the evening either, or the morning, or whatever it is, whatever time of day you're watching this. It's something that Buddhism doesn't really mention. I mean, there's Sama Samadhi, which indicates that there could be Micha Samadhi, or like wrong concentration, which, I mean, it could just be, some wrong concentration is just like staring fixedly at some body part of a young woman who's walking by. I mean, that would be wrong concentration, I suppose. But also, you could have like sort of bogus meditation techniques that could qualify as wrong concentration, and hypnotizing yourself and thinking that you're not hypnotizing yourself. It happens a lot in Burma. I have to admit, a lot of people in Burma, like even meditation teachers, they're not sophisticated enough thinkers, or they just are unfamiliar with hypnosis, so they cannot tell the difference between jhana and a deep hypnotic trance. There's a meditation center not far from the main cave that I lived in Burma. It's in the The Ingu tradition, where they promise just even a beginning meditator that, in your first week meditation or 2-week meditation, the first retreat, that you'll be able to like teleport into heaven realms, teleport into hell realms, sit for hours straight without moving, that kind of stuff. And it just sounds more like hypnosis than some realistic expectation of some beginner who's never meditated before, who is just guaranteed that within 2 weeks, they're going to have all these psychic powers and sit like a statue for 4 hours straight. That sounds like more of a hypnotic thing to me. But again, hypnosis, I don't know if there was even really a concept of hypnosis in ancient India. I think hypnosis became a thing with some guy named Mesmer, like back in the 1700s. So it's like a modern concept. There is mention of, like, there's the list of different kinds of animal knowledge that monks shouldn't take any interest in, which includes, like, interviewing a woman in trance who's like channeling a deity or something. So that happened in ancient India. Women who would, especially women, I guess, who would go into a trance and channel, supposedly speak with the voice of a god, that kind of thing. So, that would count as hypnosis by modern standards, I think, that channelers generally are in a hypnotic trance when they're channeling. But there's no real explanation of it, not even in Abhidhamma, the commentarial tradition, that I've ever come across. It could be some obscure reference in some obscure commentary that nobody reads. But I really don't think that there really is a well-defined like explained concept of hypnosis in Pali texts or in the Pali commentarial tradition. So I'm just going to move on to Samana's second question, which is it possible that attaining jhana itself was just a hypnotizing oneself after all, maybe in more like wholesome way or something? Yeah, I've considered that jhana could be considered a kind of hypnotic trance state, except it's like a high quality hypnotic trance state where you're not just oblivious to everything around you, where you're in a heightened state of awareness. But I mean, there's certain aspects of a hypnotic trance that seem to be lacking from like really good meditation. Like when you're hypnotized, it's like your mind is just focused on this one, that you go into like a sleepy state, a somnolent state, and you might be completely oblivious to everything around you. And some people who go into meditative states are like that too. But I really do not think that fourth jhana would be like the human equivalent to being in the state of a hibernating squirrel. So, I mean, you'd have to have like a good definition of what jhana is, which is pretty much lacking. You'd have to have a really good definition of hypnosis, which is probably out there, like a hypnotic trance state. I don't know exactly what it would be. And then whether, the Venn diagram has overlap, or I guess jhana would have to be like a small circle inside the bigger circle of hypnosis in order for jhana itself to be a kind of hypnotic state. But I kind of doubt it. I would say that being in a hypnotic state could be considered wrong concentration, although, I mean, it can have its benefits. That being in a hypnotic state isn't just a bad state, but the problem is if you're gonna hypnotize yourself, you should be aware that you're hypnotizing yourself. If you're gonna be in a hypnotic trance, you should be aware that you're in a hypnotic trance and not be clueless and think that you're having some kind of supramundane transmissions or some such. So it could be that hypnosis can be beneficial, I mean, if it's done correctly, but I mean, at least you should know what it is, that it's a hypnotic trance and not some, attainment of Aryahood or some such. So is it possible that attaining jhana itself is just a hypnotizing oneself after all? I kind of doubt it, but I mean, it would depend on the definitions of terms. So I'm just going to move on to Samana's third question, which is, how would you explain the attaining jhana when it comes to jhana is necessary for enlightenment theory from earlier Theravadan's point of view? So how do you explain the attaining jhana when it comes to jhana is necessary for enlightenment? Well, I think originally jhana just meant meditation. And that's, I mean, it was dhyana in Sanskrit, which became Chan in Chinese, which became Zen in Japanese. And that's just, Zen is the meditation school. So jhana just originally meant meditation. I mean, literally means something like blazing or illumination, which was kind of a metaphor for the mental states that a person would get in when they're meditating. So, I mean, from that point of view, you could say that meditation is necessary for enlightenment, at least from a systematic, I almost said mythological, systematic. Let's just go with systematic. If you're going to like deliberately work towards enlightenment, then certainly meditation is very useful. I don't think it's absolutely necessary, because there are some people, maybe they had a lot of meditation in previous lives so that they're just ripe for it. Even in the Pali texts, there's cases of, at least in the commentarial tradition, of some 9-year-old boy who's getting his head shaved so that he can become a novice. As soon as the razor touches his head, he becomes a fully enlightened arahant. He was so ripe, he had such parami from previous existences, probably doing a lot of meditation in previous existences, that he didn't need to have formal meditation in this life. Or then you got people like Eckhart Tolle or Ramana Maharshi even, or John Ren Lewis, who just have like a near-death experience or some kind of crisis that just slams them out of samsara, slams them out of their samsaric habits and liberates them. So, I mean, how it's supposed to work, though, is, I mean, I've explained this numerous times before. It's like mental states are waves. Consciousness is just water. So your mental states are just like ripples on your consciousness. And samsara is just being stuck at the level of the waves. It's the forms, the forms that the surface of the water takes. So if you want to like penetrate that, you want to transcend these forms. Stop identifying with all the multiple waves, and I like this wave and I don't like that wave, and this wave is beautiful and that wave is ugly, etc., etc. So for as long as samsara lasts. Instead, you calm the surface so there aren't any more waves to be distracted by, or at least they become so subtle that they're no longer a distraction. And then you can get the insight that allows you to penetrate through the forms and just get to the essence of water or consciousness. And that is what essentially helps to liberate you. And then after you've been like enlightened, after you're no longer distracted by the waves, you just penetrate through that. Then even after the waves come back, you're no longer sitting there cross-legged in deep meditation anymore. Still, you have the insight that allows you to continue just seeing the waves as water, just seeing the essence instead of being distracted and led astray by the forms. So that would be the mechanism of how jhana helps you to become enlightened. At least that's one of the mechanisms. So, I mean, there's I've mentioned it numerous times before, the lesser discourse on voidness of the Majjhima Nikaya, the Chula Sunyata Sutta, where you've got a monk who goes out into the forest and he's cultivating emptiness or voidness. First step is you just go out into the forest, and so you've left behind the commotion and distraction of all the artificiality in the village. And so you've got a relative emptiness, and then you start cultivating meditative states until you get to the highest possible meditative state. And then when you come out of that, you realize that was the highest possible attainable meditative state, and still that's not enlightenment. And so that can cause like a click of insight that just kind of causes you to let go of the whole samsaric system, and that's like a liberating insight also. But I think I should just move on to the next question now. This is from White Ash Piper. And White Ash Piper says, curious on karma and rebirth and the point you brought up on a child being born and dying hardly out of the gate. My takeaway is this baby had just enough karma to be human, but albeit briefly, ? I think it was on the cat-dog karma question. Yeah, I do have this hypothesis, unprovable, that one of our dogs had been like a human baby that, I mean, it got old enough that, it was aware of its surroundings and starting to have a personality, but it was still like pre-verbal, and then passed away. I do think that some pets, like, they have alternated between like a dog or just some human baby that just died very young, which most human babies did throughout much of our history. And it's not necessarily that you've got a human baby who dies. It's not necessarily that they had just enough karma to be human, but only briefly. It could be that they had karma to be human, but also not to get very advanced with it. They didn't have the karma to be like a verbal, speaking, functioning adult. They just had the karma to sort of get to a certain stage. And then it was like they didn't have the karma to proceed from past that. Or it could be that they just had some bad karma that just sort of interrupted that. Maybe they were, they had caused babies to stop metabolizing in a previous life. You know, they were like, who knows? You know, I could name, say like an abortionist or something. I don't know. But I mean, infanticide was fairly common in ancient times, back before they had reliable abortion clinics. You just take the baby and just abandon it out in the woods somewhere where it would die of exposure or get eaten by animals or something. And so people that did that would be making some kind of karma that might come back on them. They get reborn and they get this bad baby stuff done to them, or they just die. So I mean, there's more than one explanation for how the karma works of a baby who is born and then just does not grow into childhood. You know, they just have sudden infant death syndrome when they're just 2 weeks old, or they get like scarlet fever or whooping cough or something. I mean, that used to happen a lot. And I think even like in the Middle Ages, most babies did not reach adulthood. You know, that's one reason why the Middle Ages in Europe were kind of a sociopathic age, is that the parents could not get emotionally invested in their children because most of them were just going to die anyway. And so they were treated like livestock. And, you know, they just received the kind of neglect and harshness that produces sociopaths, hardened criminals in modern times. And like the entire culture was like that, other than maybe a few people that were just soft-hearted and were willing to take the risk of dearly loving this baby that, you know, statistically was probably not going to reach the age of 10. But I think I'm meandering away from the question. Curious on karma and rebirth, and the point you brought up on a child being born and dying hardly out of the gate. My takeaway is this baby had just enough karma to be human, but albeit briefly, ? So that's the question. And yeah, it doesn't necessarily work that way. There's karma is very complicated. It's unthinkably, you know, incomprehensibly complicated. And so you can't really figure it out. And it's not going to be the same for everybody. That different individuals are going to have different karma that may result in similar outward experiences, but it might be just different reasons. You know, it's like the baby dies because they had just enough karma to be human, or they had you know, to be human but very briefly, or they had the karma to get sort of into a baby mental state, but they didn't have the karma to go beyond that. Or it could be some bad karma from a previous life just cut their life short because they were cutting the lives short of others or some such. There's all these different possibilities, and it's just not one size fits all. There's always going to be this just unthinkable complexity going on, and all these different factors that are combining and interacting and so forth that's going to result in the situation. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Meditator's Library. And Meditator's Library says, ever since disrobing, how did your inner peace, spirituality, or faith in Buddha change over time? Please share your thoughts. Well, my inner peace is not as good as it was when I was a monk, just living in simplicity and solitude in a cave. That now I'm like, for a living, I'm driving a forklift for a trucking company, and it's just hectic chaos a lot of the time. Like the other night, 2 nights ago, I was traumatized where there was this huge fireplace, like an electric fireplace. It weighed like 800 pounds. It was like 6 feet tall and like 6 feet wide, maybe 2.5 feet thick. And it was just too big to fit onto the truck right side up. So they were going to tip it onto its side, onto a pallet, and load it that way. And there was a miscommunication between one guy and the other guy. One guy was supposed to hold the pallet up with a forklift on this side, and then the other guy was just going to push it over onto that pallet. You know, it's going to just lean over a little bit, and then gradually you lower the pallet, and then the thing winds up lying on it. That was the idea. But the guy who was supposed to be holding up the pallet didn't know what he was doing. Nobody fully explained the situation. So he's just kind of sitting there with the pallet on the floor. The one guy just tips over this huge fireplace, and it just smashes. I mean, it's just destroyed. And I was just standing there. first I just kind of throw my hands over my ears just because I was expecting the crash. And it was just, that kind of stuff is not conducive to peace of mind in my case. Or you're just this hectic chaos going on. I'm like cussing, like to myself. I'm not like cussing out others. But it's like, what the fuck are you doing? You know, just this little commentary of cuss words going on while I'm driving my forklift sometimes. So my inner peace is less, although fortunately I have acquired enough insight that I really don't take samsaric quasi-reality as seriously as most people do. I'm not as stuck in it as most people are, even though there's like this habitual cussing going on, that kind of thing. So let's see, my inner peace, yeah, that has like decreased, at least at the superficial level. Spirituality, I mean, it's like I received my education and now I'm putting it into practice. My faith in Buddha is unchanged. So yeah, ever since disrobing, yeah, there have been some changes, but not really super major ones. They're like superficial outward changes more than like the deep inward stuff. So I'm just going to move on to Meditator's Library's second question. What is your take on the Theravada tradition or belief that one has to get ordained as bhikkhu upon anagami enlightenment within 7 days or he dies? It's not anagami, it's arahant. That the Theravada Buddhist tradition is that you have to be, or if you become enlightened, you can be enlightened if you're not an ordained monk, but you have to get ordained fast. And it could be less than 7 days, like the Bahia Sutta, the non-Buddhist philosopher Bahia goes and speaks to the Buddha. The Buddha gives him this koan-like little sermon in the middle of town, and Bahia becomes enlightened. And then within like an hour, he dies. He's trampled to death by a young cow. So, I mean, it's not just 7 days necessarily. I mean, it's like you're on borrowed time if you're enlightened and you're not a monk going with Theravada tradition. But personally, I am skeptical of that. I think that there have been enlightened people who were not ordained bhikkhus or bhikkhunis or even novices that lived for more than a week. So I do think to some degree it's kind of a Theravada chauvinism, you know, saying, you know, you have to be, you know, one of us if you're going to be fully enlightened for very long, or, you know, it's, you better join us or you're going to pay the price kind of a thing. And I do think there's a certain amount of chauvinism or like religious propaganda, that kind of thing involved. So, Meditator's Library's third question. Is anagami enlightenment possible for a lone recluse or bhikkhu, samana in parentheses, who lives alone in forest without connection, any sangha, but lives on his pension money or some kind of savings? Well, I mean, he shouldn't be a bhikkhu if he's got money. You know, you'd be better off not being a bhikkhu if you're going to be living on pension money or some kind of savings, because a monk's not allowed to have money, period. And I mean, again, I think he's confusing anagami with arahant, that being fully enlightened. Yeah, I don't see why not. I don't see why it would be impossible for some lone recluse who isn't even ordained to be just going alone like the horn of the rhinoceros. I mean, that's what the Buddha taught. You're supposed to live in dependence upon a teacher. Even if you're a bhikkhu, you live on independence upon a teacher or your preceptor for at least 5 years. But once you know how to meditate, you know how to do all the stuff a monk's supposed to do, you know how to follow the rules and bake a bowl and sew your robes and all that, then you can just go off alone. And the Pali texts are full of monks that just go out into solitude and become enlightened. Well, I mean, you might have a brief connection with the Sangha. You might go and meet with the monks every 2 weeks to do the Uposatha ceremony or some such. But I don't think even that much is necessary. I don't think it's necessary to be a bhikkhu. That if you're, I mean, I assume there have been, assuming that that enlightenment even means anything in a samsaric context, that there have been people who've just gone off and done it alone and become enlightened. Some of them have probably even handled money. So, yeah, lives alone in a forest without any connection to any sangha, but lives on pension money or some kind of savings. I don't see why it would be impossible. Like, becoming enlightened on your own without guidance or feedback can be tricky, because you're going to have blind spots that you're going to have, like foibles or defilements that you don't see, that nobody's going to tell you about because you're alone. So there are certain disadvantages to radical solitude, but for the most part, it is encouraged in Theravada Buddhism that you go alone like the horn of the rhinoceros. You just go off. Once you know what to do, you know how to practice correctly, you just go off into the forest and do it. And there's nothing necessarily immoral about living on a pension, but it is against the rules for an ordained monk to handle money. Even a 10-precept novice isn't supposed to handle money, even though almost all 10-precept novices in Burma handle it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. And PSA says, which sport is your favorite from the following list? Hockey, soccer, water polo, or javelin throwing? Well, hockey, the fights are interesting, but every once in a while they stop fighting and start hitting this little puck around, which is kind of not so interesting. Soccer, I never really understood why you have so many fanatical soccer fans in this world. Why? What is so exciting? These guys, I mean, you can have an hour-long soccer match and the score is still 0-0. Water polo could be interesting, but most of the action's going on under the water, where they're like kicking each other and stuff, and you don't get to see that part. So, I mean, if I had to watch any of these on like a video, I'd probably watch javelin throwing just for the novelty of it. I mean, it's not really all that exciting. I mean, there's not a whole lot of variety. There's not a whole lot of different strategies and all that. But what the hell? At least it doesn't last very long. You know, they just run up to the line and throw the javelin, and they measure how far it went, and whoever threw it the farthest wins, I guess. So I think I'm just going to move on to PSA's next question, which is, have you decided yet what you will do to those that end up on your blacklist? Do they have any chance of salvation? Well, technically, that's two questions. So actually, PSA has transgressed here, and I think his name's going on that list. And because his name is on the list, I don't think it would be appropriate for me to actually specify what's going to happen to him. But he's not going to like it very much if he ever finds out what it was that happened to him. And nevertheless, everyone has a chance of salvation. So don't worry about that. There's no eternal damnation involved in these lists. So I'm just going to move on to PSA's next question. What is your favorite sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya and why? And the Samyutta Nikaya has a lot of really good suttas in it. So, you know, like the first two suttas, you know, traditionally the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta and the Anattalakkana Sutta are both in the Samyutta. The first Samyutta, the Sagata Vagga, the first chapter of the first Samyutta, has some very archaic, just very profound, pithy kind of suttas that are good. There's one sutta from the Samyutta Nikaya that receives a lot of discussion in Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika, which, I mean, he's going with a Sanskrit non-Theravadan version of the same sutta, but it's Mahakachayana, I think, is like the monk who's teaching this, and it's very Zen-like, and I don't remember the name of the sutta, unfortunately, but the one sutta that really comes to mind that has had a more of an effect on me than this one with Mahakachayana is, let's see here. It's called the Lokayatika Sutta, and it's in the Nidana Samyutta, which is all about dependent co-arising, and it's a strange case study because it's like a mixture of like older, like more profound material and like younger, less profound material, and the whole thing is a patchwork. But the main point of it is really deep, and I like it. And so I happened to translated it myself some years ago. And so the first part of the sutta goes, "Thus have I heard, at one time the Blessed One was dwelling at Sawati at Jeta's Grove in Anata Pandika's Park," which is how a great many suttas begin. Then it's like you got the main meat of the sutta here, which is in this part. "At that time, a Brahmin who was a worldly philosopher approached the Blessed One and exchanged the customary friendly greetings with him. And sitting to one side, that Brahmin worldly philosopher said this to the Blessed One: 'How is it, Sir Gautama, does everything exist?' 'Everything exists. Indeed, Brahmin. This is the oldest philosophy in the world,' said the Buddha." So then the Brahmin says, "Well then, how is it, Sir Gautama, does nothing exist?" And the Buddha says, "Nothing exists. Indeed, Brahmin. This is the second philosophy of the world." So then the Brahmin says, "Well then, how is it, Sir Gautama, is everything a unity?" And then the Buddha says, "Everything is a unity. Indeed, Brahmin, this is the third philosophy of the world." And then the Brahmin says, "Well then, how is it, Sir Gautama, is everything a multiplicity?" And then the Buddha says, "Everything is a multiplicity. Indeed, Brahmin, this is the fourth philosophy of the world." But not tending to either extreme, Brahmin, the Tathagata teaches the way by the middle. And then it just plugs in the stock description of the 12 links of dependent co-arising, which doesn't really work very well because the Buddha has just ruled out multiplicity. And here you've got this 12 link that's just spewing multiplicity. So then after the Buddha gives the 12 links forwards and backwards, or mainly, let's see, the creation and the cessation aspects of the 12 links, then you wind up with this a stock phrase again, which occurs lots and lots of times, which is, see, when this had been said, the Brahmin worldly philosopher said this: "Excellent Sir Gautama, excellent Sir Gautama, just as Sir Gautama, one would set aright what had been tipped over, would reveal what had been covered, would explain the road to one who was lost, or would hold up an oil lamp in the darkness so that those with eyes could see what is visible. Even so, the Dhamma has been showed by Sir Gautama in many ways. I go to Sir Gautama for refuge, and to the Dhamma and to the community of monks. May Sir Gautama consider me to be a lay supporter from this day on. For the rest of my life, I have taken refuge." And according to the text, if we are to accept this as just historical fact, that there were dozens of people who would give this exact same speech. Just as Sir Gautama, one would set aright what has been tipped over, etc., etc., etc. That's just the standard speech given by people who are converted to Buddhism after having a talk with the Buddha. So it's kind of a really convenient case study of how suttas are composed. You've got like this nucleus of useful information, which is like the back and forth between the worldly philosopher, the Lokayatika, and the Buddha, where he's ruling out everything exists. He rules out nothing exists. That the middle path, the Majjhima Patipada, is like in between is and isn't. And then the worldly philosopher says, well, is everything a unity? Is everything just one? Or is everything many? And again, the Buddha says that both of those are extremes, that you've got this middle path. It's not just the middle path between self-indulgence and self-torture. It's the middle path between is and isn't. It's the middle path between one and more than one. One and many. unity and multiplicity. And so it really gives you an insight into what the middle path that the Buddha was teaching is like. It's kind of mind-blowing and Zen-like. And then monks who did not understand dependent co-arising just plug in the 12 links, which doesn't even fit the context here. But still, it's just because of the dialogue between the worldly philosopher and the Buddha, that it really does have some profundity that I can appreciate. Just the middle path is not just the middle path between self-indulgence and self-torture. It's the middle path between is and isn't. And there are other suttas that say that existence and non-existence are just like a mental formation. So, I think it's the Kalahawiwada Sutta of the Atthakavagga says this. Pretty sure, if I remember correctly. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Gaz. And Gaz says, what is your general opinion of Neoplatonism? And my friend Numa would know more about this than I do, because he's actually a practicing Neoplatonist. And we did at least one video on the subject, which is on my playlist, one of my playlists on YouTube, probably also on BitChute, where we discuss Neoplatonism. My general opinion of Neoplatonism, I am sorry that it lost out to Christianity in ancient times, that it was sort of like the main rival of Christianity with regard to what was going to be like this, like the mass religion of the people of the Roman Empire. And if the Emperor Julian the Apostate hadn't died in a war in Persia after being emperor for only a couple years, he was trying to get Neoplatonism installed as the state religion, and it didn't work. It was possibly too little too late at that point. But Neoplatonism, I mean, it could be considered an enlightenment tradition. That Plotinus, who is one of the most famous teachers of what would be called Neoplatonism, I mean, he had some deep insight. I don't know if he was enlightened or not, but he was a profound thinker, and his thinking was pretty much along Indian lines with regard to how reality works, how this world appears to exist, that kind of stuff. There was a lot of Neoplatonism that I really didn't have much use for. When you're getting into all the archons and the different levels of deities and so forth, they get really complicated with regard to the classification of the different levels and all this. I think that's just kind of like clutter, that it's not really necessary. But yeah, Neoplatonism actually went through different phases. Like shortly after the death of Plato, it became just kind of a skeptical school. But generally, when people think of Neoplatonism, they're thinking more along the lines of the system that Julian the Apostate was trying to establish in Rome. And it's definitely a more spiritual type of ancient Greek philosophy than some of the ancient Greek philosophies. And again, I do consider it to be unfortunate that it was Christianity and not Neoplatonism that became the predominant religion of the West. So, I think I should just move on to Gaz's second question, which is actually two questions, but he doesn't go on the list because even if you divide it into two questions, it's still just three. And his second question is, have you seen the film Stalker? And not only have I seen the film Stalker, but one of the best essays I ever wrote, at least stylistically, is like an analysis of the movie Stalker. And it's online. You want my take on Stalker, just go to my blog. The link should be below this video. And go to my blog, and then there's like the search option, the magnifying glass icon. Just type in Stalker, and it should be the first thing that comes up. The Stalker is Holy Fool. So Yeah, I have seen the film Stalker. It'd be on my list of top 10 favorite movies. It's rather slow paced, but it is a profound movie. And the director Tarkovsky did say that this movie it's taking up Eastern themes. So it's it's just sort of on the nature of samsara, really. It is a profound movie, and I do recommend it, even though it's not an action movie. And I have also read the story that inspired it, Roadside Picnic, and the same guys who wrote the original science fiction story that Stalker is based on also wrote the screenplay for the movie. So that's one reason why the movie came out so well, even though there's not a whole lot of resemblance between Roadside Picnic and Stalker. I mean, the name Roadside Picnic comes from the idea that some very advanced space aliens just stopped on Earth. They had to pee or something. So they just stop here briefly and then just continue on their way. But they leave behind this advanced alien equivalent of like pop cans and stuff. And some of the stuff that they leave behind has these weird effects that are completely like not understandable, unintelligible to humans. And there's just, it's like the government just has to like close it off and make it just, it's like too dangerous to go in there. And in the movie, they kind of back away from the space alien idea. At the beginning of the movie, they say, we don't know what caused this area to become so weird, but it's like this surreal area. You go into this area and it's like your mental states are influencing what's going on around you. So yeah, if you want my take on Stalker, then just go to my blog and just do a search on Stalker. And again, I do consider it to be one of the best things I've written, at least from a stylistic point of view. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Lou Kelzer, I think. And Lou Kelzer says, how do you deal with the paradox that desiring to stop desiring is a desire in itself? Would not the only moral act a person could do be immediate self-deletion? I'm using a euphemism here. I know that there was a sect of Japanese Buddhist monks who used to starve themselves to death in such a way to mummify their own corpse. Do you have any thoughts on this? Well, there's actually 3 question marks in this question, but 3 is still allowable. So how do I deal with the paradox that desiring to stop desiring is a desire in itself? Well, eventually that final desire has to be left behind also. I've mentioned this before, how like the holy life is, or in many cases, it's a matter of renouncing the world, renouncing all your attachments and desires, and replacing them with this new attachment and desire. It's this desire for enlightenment. And so you just start practicing through this desire for enlightenment. You've got this, you're attached in mind to this goal of enlightenment, and you practice and practice and practice, and you fail because this last desire is like your last major obstacle. And so sooner or later, you have to have this insight that allows you to let go even that final attachment, and then you can become enlightened. So it's sort of useful in that it's simplifying your attachments, reducing them down to one big one instead of all these other ones. And it's a wholesome one that's at least leading you in the right direction, but it's going to prevent you from reaching the goal until you finally let go of that one last attachment. So with regard to the part of here, would not the only moral act a person could do be immediate self-deletion? No, because self-deletion generally involves unwholesome mental states, and you're just going to get reborn again. If you're not enlightened, you just get reborn. Just your karma continues to flow and just takes another form because you haven't really transcended karma yet. This karma is like the kinetic aspect of your own unenlightenment. So, yeah, the Buddha said that you should not self-delete until you have attained the goal, because otherwise you're just like pressing reset or something, and you wind up just having the same problems that you haven't solved yet, that you haven't transcended yet. So let's see. There was a sect of Japanese Buddhist monks who used to starve themselves to death in such a way. Yeah, I think they started eating like aromatic substances so that they would sort of embalm their insides before they died. And it's not in accordance with Theravada Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism, you should not self-delete unless you are enlightened, and then you can do as you please. But even most enlightened beings would not self-delete. So, yeah, I remember a few years ago, maybe several years ago at this point, somebody bought like a statue of some monk, had it sitting in his living room for years, and then somehow it fell and broke or something, and he realized that it was just like the lacquered body of an actual Buddhist monk who had gone through this procedure of sort of eating these aromatic substances and sort of embalming himself from the inside out before he died. I don't know what happened to the mummified monk after that. I think he got sent to a museum or something. But yeah, that's certainly not Theravada, and I don't think the Buddha would have endorsed that. It's just sort of Buddhism moving off in a weird direction, which does happen sometimes. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui said, would you say the Buddha had insight into anatta before or after awakening? Or did the two form a sudden irrevocable co-occurrence? And I have no idea what the mental states of the Buddha were before he became enlightened. It could be that he had some inkling or intuition of no self, which then like became a full-blown liberating insight at enlightenment. That, he may have already kind of had some vague idea or philosophy going in that direction, but who knows? Who could possibly know what his mental states were like before his enlightenment, other than what you read in the text, which is largely legends. So, yeah, whether the Buddha, he had insight into no self or not, because that's what anatta means for those of you who are beginners at this sort of thing. Anatta means no self, also no soul, no individuality. And when he started endorsing that, I keep wanting to say believing that, but it's not a matter of belief once you're enlightened. So, maybe he believed it before he became enlightened, but who could possibly know? I have no idea. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, Sabe Sankara Dukkha, Sabe Sankara Anicca, Sabe Dhamma Anatta. If everything is anatta, no self, like in the previous question, if everyone is anatta, whether they realize it or not, samsara is therefore more like a fire that is being lit up and fed constantly. What really keeps us trapped is the ignorance of the flame that keeps samsara going. In that case, nibbana is more of a putting out of a candle than an enlightenment. It's like a cessation of a fire. And in that same case, samsara is not a place. It's an action, it's a habit, it's the primordial addiction. And then I think he asked for thoughts, but for some reason, there's no question mark at all here. I think it just I'm pretty sure there was a question. I think he's just asking for my feedback on this idea. So, yeah, samsara isn't a place. It's an infinite number of sort of illusory places, but it's not really a place. It's like perception, essentially. Perception is samsara. And so the cessation of perception, or rather the transcendence of it, would be enlightenment. It's like the statues in the uncarved block of marble, that thinking the statue is real is samsara, but once you become enlightened, the block of marble is still there. The statue is still there in virtual form, but you're no longer attaching to the idea that statue is real. So, yeah, I do definitely agree that samsara is not a place. It is like a process, and it's mainly the process of perception especially the belief that the perception is real, that the perception is conveying reality, which it is not. It's symbols. So samsara is symbols. It's like being stuck in symbols. And after you're enlightened, the symbol may still be there, like potentially, but you're just no longer identifying with that and fixating on that and like attaching to that. So going back up to the top here, I want to do justice to this, if at all possible. If everyone is without self, whether they realize it or not, samsara is therefore more like a fire that is being lit up and fed constantly. Yeah, well, it's like delusion, I guess. That's why nirvana literally means blowing out. It's like the blowing out of a fire, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's extinction with leaving nothing behind. It really leaves everything behind. It leaves reality behind. So it's like the illusion blows out, but just because the illusion blows out doesn't mean that there's nothing left except from like a diluted point of view. So what really keeps us trapped is the ignorance of the flame that keeps samsara going. Yeah, well, the samsara is the flame, I guess. And in that case, nibbana is more of a putting out of a candle than an enlightenment. Well, I mean, it's still an enlightenment. It's still, you're waking up from the dream. You're no longer believing an illusion is reality. So then you wake up, you become Buddha. Buddha just means awakened. So you wake up from the dream, and then what is left behind is reality. The reality doesn't go anywhere. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Romeo. And Romeo says, what's up with the jolly fat Buddha statues I see in the windows of Asian nail salons, Chinese restaurants, and the like? Who is this portly figure, and why is his image or statue so ubiquitous that he is often confused with the very Buddha himself? What is his significance to Buddhism? And yeah, I used to be bothered. Before I became a monk, I was bothered by people thinking that the Buddha was this fat guy. And I knew that it wasn't the case because my father always had at least one statue of Hote, and that's the Japanese name for him is Hote. And usually he's got a great big belly that's like uncovered, undraped, and his hands are kind of up like this. And the version I read is that he was like a Zen monk in medieval or late ancient China. I guess it'd be like medieval China. And he was sort of like the village idiot kind of. He was sort of like mentally retarded to some degree, although apparently that occurred only at like the intellectual level because, he was like saintly and spiritual at the same time. So intelligence and wisdom are two entirely different things. So anyways, he was like this ordained Zen monk, I guess, who would go around asking for spare change, because I guess it's not against the rules for Zen monks in medieval China to handle money. And then he would go to like a sweet shop and buy sweets and distribute it to the kids. That's what he asked them for the money for. And so he became sort of like a Chinese Santa Claus. And how he gets confused with the Buddha is that tradition started considering him to be like the next Buddha. He's going to be Maitreya Buddha. He's going to be the next Buddha. And he was sort of like a bodhisattva of the coming Maitreya Buddha. And so he was this fat, cheerful, kid-loving monk who was sort of like the Buddhist Santa Claus in China, and he's going to be Maitreya Buddha in a future life. And people who really don't understand Buddhism very well will think that that's the Buddha. It's like, I remember hearing some Christian, like a televangelist, saying that the Buddhists have a false religion because they worship a fat, lazy God. And, just there's a number of inaccuracies combined into that statement. But yeah, his Japanese name is Hote, and you're supposed to rub his belly for good luck. Whether it actually works or not, I can't really say for sure. So yeah, it was like a medieval Chinese Zen monk, Chan monk, at least the version I read that explained it, who just got all this mythology bound up with him, and he's going to be the next Buddha named Maitreya Buddha. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Master Poe. And Master Poe says, have you read Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, or Hesse? And yeah, I have. When I was in my mid-20s, I went through a Hermann Hesse phase and read several of his novels. And so I did read Siddhartha and saw the movie too. It's a made in India movie, which was pretty good. And I have to say that it's not my favorite Hermann Hesse novel. I think my favorite Hesse novel would be Steppenwolf. But Siddhartha's nice. Yeah, it's a good novel. Maybe my second favorite Hermann Hesse novel. So yeah, I've read it. I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from La Infamia. And La Infamia says, how can I get into that Discord group? Most of groups outside, they are so feminized. Well, like I tell everybody else, if you do a little diligent searching, you should be able to find my email address, and then you can state your case there as to why I should send you the invite link. But I can't just blurt out, the invite link or anything like that. So you'll have to do a little bit of informed searching, which shouldn't be too hard. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, can you give your thoughts on this video? And the video is, strangely, it's an old Oprah Winfrey clip from, it looks like from like the 1980s or something. Maybe the 90s, I'm not sure. I think it's on YouTube. And it's about the function of the subconscious mind. She's talking to some writer, and he's talking about how some creative writing is just like dictation, where you just kind of sit in front of the typewriter. It's that old of a video. And I think it was Miller, not Norman Mailer, but I can't remember his first name, Miller. Famous writer named Miller, mid to late 20th century, who he would just sit in front of his typewriter and just kind of go blank and then just kind of channel what he was writing. He supposedly wrote an entire novel that way. And it's like not so much a muse like people would have believed in ancient, like pagan antiquity, where it's the muses that are inspiring your creative endeavors, that it's the subconscious mind kind of working its way to the surface. And he's talking about how the subconscious mind works symbolically instead of linguistically. Like one case he mentions is the guy who he discovered the benzene ring. He was a chemist, and he wanted to know the shape of a benzene molecule. And he's thinking about it, and he can't figure it out. And then he falls asleep. He's like sitting on a couch in front of his fireplace. He falls asleep and has a dream about a snake that's biting its own tail. And then when he wakes up, he realizes that benzene is like a ring. And it was like this symbolic dream that caused him to realize this. And apparently, like deep down, he already knew. And it wasn't just that your subconscious mind tells you in words. Sometimes it's through symbols like this, like dream imagery and so forth, that the subconscious mind communicates to the conscious ego. So what are my thoughts on the video? Yeah, I guess so. That it does seem to work that way. That I'm not exactly sure why it is that your subconscious mind knows things that your conscious ego doesn't know, and then sometimes it will convey that information not through words so much as through dream symbols and so forth. I'm not exactly sure of the why regarding that. His idea was that the subconscious mind has been around a lot longer than language has, and so it's just sort of like instinctive. It's just built into us that the subconscious mind is not going to be dealing so much in verbal language as in just symbols. But personally, I'm not exactly sure why it works that way. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Hurdy-Gurdy Man. And Hurdy-Gurdy Man says, what is your best step advice for eliminating fear and cultivating bravery for someone who's generally a fearful person? Well, one thing that came to mind is that the medieval Japanese samurai would actually spend time at Zen monasteries to help them overcome their fear of death. And just practicing Buddhism and taking it seriously, I mean, once you get to the realization that this isn't ultimately real anyway, that we don't ultimately exist, that it really doesn't matter, that, I mean, that helps a lot. I mean, when I was young, I was much more timid than I am now, much more averse to taking risks and so forth than I am now, at least in certain ways. So overall, I'm more fearless now. Maybe just because I'm older, but it's hard to say. But I do think that like 30 years of being a Buddhist monk definitely helped me to overcome fear, where it's just, I mean, you protect Dhamma, Dhamma protects you. Everything happens the way it's supposed to happen. And I mean, it's created by mind. That's one thing that really works for me, is the idea fear is an unskillful mental state. Fear or like worry, anxiety, you're making bad karma through doing it. So actually being afraid that something bad is going to happen increases the odds of something bad happening. That just detachment and just having faith, that everything happens the way it's supposed to happen, and just be mindful, take precautions, be careful with what you're doing, and then just do it. Do what you say, what you think needs to be done. And I mean, fear is the mind killer, as it says in Dune. But really, it's an unskillful mental state. And once you take that to heart, like once you can really appreciate the idea that fear or worry or regret, any of these kind of mental states really are just poisoning your system. That's essentially what you're doing. They are toxic mental states. And so once you can see that with a fair amount of insight or clarity, then, it just stops even being really an option. It's like, well, should I just hit my hand with this hammer? It's like, why would you do that? In advance that it's going to hurt, it's going to mess up your hand. And it's the same way with like worry or fear, that kind of stuff. Once you get to a certain degree of like progress in your practice or whatever, you can see, it's like hitting your hand with a hammer. It's all you're doing is you're poisoning your system. You're making bad karma for yourself. So just a certain amount of like mindful detachment. Like if you're in the habit of being fearful, observe the fear. What does the fear feel like? How does it make your stomach feel? How does it make your head feel? What kind of bodily sensations, and then just like the mental sensations of fear. It's like, if you can get to the point of fear is arising rather than I'm afraid, then you've already detached from it. It's not you anymore. Then you have more freedom to decide what to do appropriately. But again, fear is an unskillful mental state. It's bad karma. It's toxic to your system, and it just makes things worse. Although it is true, if somebody put a knife to my throat, my heart rate would increase. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Count 9. And Count 9 says, Count 9 went on like this long, surreal description of like synchronicity around the letter F that had been occurring in his life recently. So he says, amazingly, I haven't also found any F sound in Pali. No place, neither in the beginning nor anywhere else. Did you mention it already, or have I slept in the meanwhile, or maybe dreamed completely the whole thing? However, it seems that any classical Indian language has no such use for F. I wonder, how was it regarding the Western branches of the Indo-European language? And I have done a little research into this, and it turns out that the scholars, the experts, the authorities are of the opinion that in Proto-Indo-European, the language that is like the ancestor of English, German, French, like Latin, Greek, Armenian, Sanskrit, Persian, etc., there was no F sound. And it's kind of weird that F is kind of an unusual sound. Some Asian languages don't have F either. Like Burmese doesn't have an F sound either. So the original Proto-Indo-European language apparently didn't have an F sound. Although, like in Greek, they've got like PHI. I mean, in Homeric Greek, there was even like an F, which is where the Romans got their symbol for the letter F, was from an F in like a digamma, I think it was called in Homeric Greek. But they have in Greek, they've got the F sound, but the experts believe that came from an aspirated BH in Proto-Indo-European. So BH became like PH in Greek. And then the F in Germanic languages have lots of Fs, like pater became father in like English, which is a Germanic language. Like the word for fire, like it started with a P, like pyromaniac, or the funeral pyre became fire in English, which again is a Germanic language. The word five, comes like in Greek, it's penta. In Sanskrit and Pali, it's pancha, and then it becomes five in German. So there's some law, I can't remember if it's Grimm's law or something, that includes the idea that P's in older, like Indo-European languages somehow got turned into F's in Germanic languages. So that's how English has the F sound, is that P got turned into F in Germanic languages, or evolved into F, mutated into F. So, yeah, I'm not sure about Latin. Latin has like Flavius, that has an F sound too, and I'm not sure how Latin got the F sound, but it's different for the Greeks and the Germans. The Germans, it was P turned into F. For the Greeks, it was BH turns into F, and it just nothing turned into F in the Indian languages like Sanskrit or Pali. And Burma has no F either. So they usually try to replace it with an aspirated P, which doesn't work very good. Like fish, they try to say the English word fish. If they don't know how to say F, they'll say pish. So I'm just going to move on to count 9's second question. In the stream of samsara, do you see any similarities between a forklift operator and the ferryman? Well, I mean, they tend to both be men, I guess, who operate a vehicle. But a forklift operator has no passengers. It's against the rules, strictly against the rules, to carry a passenger on a forklift, whereas ferries pretty much by definition have to have passengers. Otherwise, I mean, why would the ferryman keep going back and forth across the body of water without ferrying anyone across? So I guess I'm ferrying like freight, which is an F word, ferrying freight with the forklift. But I think this is sort of a whimsical kind of a question. And so I think my answer is sufficient for its purpose. And so I'm just going to move on to count 9's third question, which is any news from the aquarium? And actually I was seriously considering doing an aquarium video soon. My sweetheart just tells me to just give up the aquarium videos because not very many people watch them. But even if only 5 people watched my aquarium videos, I would still stubbornly, obstinately persist in aquarium videos, and there have been some significant changes, like the whole ecosystem. Like my previous aquarium video was talking about how just adding one new species to a fish tank can completely radically change how the whole ecological balance in the tank. That happened again. And I got one little Siamese algae eater about this big, and because the way it worked was had a lot of algae in the tank, and the little otocinclus algae eaters and the snails weren't really keeping up with it. And then I got these loaches that specialize in eating snails. There was the snail apocalypse, and algae started exploding in the tank, including this black beard algae that most snails and the little otocinclus won't eat. So I get this Siamese algae eater about this big. I put it in there, and like a month later, that same algae eater is like this big, and all the algae is just gone. And he's like the biggest fish in the tank now. I mean, he's like a trout or something now. So if you want more news from the aquarium, I guess maybe I'll do the video tomorrow, and then over the course of some days, just spacing out the videos a little, it'll go up, and I'll be discussing also the idea of having like substrates, like whether you should have like a layer of soil underneath, which is what a lot of people are saying now. It's like sort of a new thing in aquarium keeping, where underneath the sand or gravel, you got a layer of potting soil so that the plants will get get more nutrients, that kind of thing. And also just discussing sort of water quality and so forth. So it's going to be of zero interest to most people, but it's still of interest to me, and so I talk about it. And let's see, any more news from the aquarium? I did get a few more plants, which also will be featured in the aquarium video tomorrow, I think. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from the proto-pseudo-monk. And the proto-pseudo-monk says, why have the far left gone totally insane? Why do they hate Trump and Musk so much? They are clearly good moral people trying to improve the world. I don't understand what the left are so angry about. Okay, well, it's kind of like two questions, isn't it? So why have the far left gone totally insane? Well, I think a large part of it is, I mean, you start off with something like Marxism, which, I mean, it wasn't really effective because it really didn't apply to empirical reality very well. You know, it's just, Marxism just goes against human nature, which is one reason why Marx didn't even believe that human nature existed. He believed in sort of like the blank slate idea that, you know, it's like there is no such thing as human animal instincts. And that is just patently false, which is one of the main reasons why Marxism doesn't work. It is unnatural. It goes against human nature. And so it has to be enforced at gunpoint as a general rule. So you're starting with that. And now you've got like cultural Marxism, like a neo-Marxism that is no longer under the control of intellectual white men. It's now under the control of women and just diversity hires in general. And so you wind up with something like biological Leninism, which is an interesting subject. Like the Soviet Union had this handicap in that it wasn't a person's skill at some task that got them a position in the government or a position. I mean, in a socialist society, you know, any position is a position in the government. But it was like their loyalty to the party, their loyalty to Lenin or Stalin or whatever. That's what got them their jobs. And so you didn't have a meritocracy. And that was, I mean, when you get away from meritocracy, Darwin just sinks his talons into you and starts tearing you apart because it's survival of the fittest. And this is viewed as like hate speech by these like hysterical low IQ, irrational new leftists who just have to insist everyone is the same. And so you can just pick people at random and put them in any job. I mean, it might not be quite that extreme, but it's definitely leaning in that direction. Like shortly after Trump became president, I mentioned this in a previous video, you had an army helicopter crash into a commercial jetliner, killing a bunch of people. Turns out the helicopter was piloted by a diversity hire. Then you had, just shortly after that, you had an American airplane flip upside down at an airport in Canada. Turns out the pilot was a diversity hire. And it's like you have this Marxism that didn't really work. And then it gets taken over by hysterical, irrational people, many of whom are stupid. But you can't say that. You cannot acknowledge the empirical fact of that because that's hate speech. And so it's like they're just kicking meritocracy in the head and expecting to do better than meritocracy. And Charles Darwin just doesn't put up with that shit. So that's the first question, I guess. And so the second question from the proto-pseudo-monk is, why do they hate Trump and Musk so much? Because they just insist on having their way. They prefer their ideology to actual empirical reality. And I mean, they used to like Trump and Musk up until Trump and Musk rejected their ideology. And it's just like religious fanaticism at this point. In fact, the religious fanaticism has become self-destructive because any position that Trump or Musk adopt, they'll take the opposite. So Trump and Musk will adopt a position that's supported by 80% of the country. The hysterical left will immediately start championing this 20% position that is just overwhelmingly disapproved of, just out of hysteria. They liked Musk, and then now they're like destroying Teslas just because, it's like now they're opposed to reducing waste and corruption in the federal government. Now they're opposed to deporting violent illegal alien criminals. It's just this hysterical fanaticism that has just gotten out of control. And it's largely fueled by the low intelligence of diversity hires that have found themselves up in positions of authority on the left. So, it says there are clearly good moral people trying to improve the world. Well, some of them are. And I don't understand what the left are so angry about. It's sort of like early Christians were pretty angry about Julian the Apostate promoting paganism instead of Christianity. He just became the Antichrist right there. Boom. It was pretty much the same with early Christianity in the Roman Empire. Any emperor who the Christians didn't like, he was Mr. 666. He was the Antichrist. So I think I'm just going to move on to this next part by the proto-pseudo-monk, which isn't a question, but I don't know. I'm just going to say it anyway. Would love a weekly show on Punyo's political analysis of U.S. world politics! ! We must hear the sage to straighten our minds in the midst of propaganda and delusional beings. Yeah, I don't know if I'd really be able to come up with enough for a weekly rant, because that's what it would have to be. If I was going to do any kind of political show like on YouTube, I'd have to be ranting good in order for it to be worth my while. Then it can sort of be catharsis. It's like a few times recently, a person called Extremely Rare Bird was kind of doing like a leftist rant in the comments. And I kind of looked forward to it because it gave me an opportunity to do like a counter rant. And I guess for some reason, ranting just has a certain cathartic effect that is kind of causes an emotional satisfaction, although of course it's creating more karma and the vicious circle and all that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Arain. And Arain says, what did the Buddha teach about dreams? I always have super vivid long dreams each night and wake up feeling like I was dreaming for many hours and living in another life while I slept. At times I can identify themes from my subconscious seeping through, but most of the time it is very mundane. What is your own personal theory on dreams, and do they align with the Buddha, Freud, or Jung at all? Well, with regard to, the very first question here, the very first question mark, I should say, what did the Buddha teach about dreams? This is yet another one of these topics that, we've had several in this Q&A, that it's a well-known phenomenon, dreaming. People were dreaming in ancient India. It's just that Theravada Buddhism really doesn't have much of a position on dreams, like Abhidhamma, which supposedly explains everything, doesn't really explain dreams. What is the purpose of dreams? Why? Anything like that. There's mention of dreams, like the Buddha was supposedly conceived when his wife, Mahamaya, was having a dream of a white elephant that entered her body, and then she woke up pregnant the next day. So, the Buddha was conceived through a dream, according to the legend. There's occasional mentions of dreams in Pali literature. It's just that it doesn't really explain why people have dreams. It's just accepted like gravity as it's just something that they didn't bother to even try to explain it, which is unfortunate, I guess. But let's see, that was the first question mark. What did the Buddha teach about dreams? I'm unaware of him teaching anything really. He may have mentioned dreams here or there, but there's no real Buddhist theory of dreams that I have ever been exposed to. So at the end, the final question mark, what is your own personal theory on dreams? And they align with the Buddha, Freud, or Jung at all? Well, yeah, we can leave the Buddha out because, again, I don't think there is like an official Theravada Buddhist theory of dreams. But like biologically, the purpose for dreams is to process information. They have found that animals that don't dream have to have larger brains in order to perform the same functions as animals that do dream. In fact, when I was in college, I did a research paper on intelligence in dolphins. And a dolphin has like an abnormally large brain. It's larger and more convoluted than our brain. And they don't have like fingers and stuff that would require extra brain tissue. So why does the dolphin have such a big brain? They're obviously very intelligent. But it wasn't until after I had written the paper years later that I found that dolphins don't dream, that they sleep only as long as they can hold their breath, which in a bottlenose dolphin is like 6 minutes. So they have to take like a little cat nap 6 minutes at a time. And they really can't sleep very much because there's like sharks and orcas and stuff. And the dolphin might not have any place to hide. They're just like floating right out there in plain sight. So that could help to explain why dolphins have such huge convoluted brains, is they don't dream. They don't have REM sleep when they're taking their little 6-minute naps. And so they have to have more brain to do the same thing. So it's like the purpose of dreaming from a biological point of view is just processing information, just kind of taking information that you acquired during the day and helping to like organize it and set up like neural links, like chains of association with other ideas, just so that you can integrate, the sensory input of that day. That would be like the main biological purpose of it. But still, like getting back to that Oprah Winfrey video clip, your subconscious mind can communicate to you through dreams. And I have found that Freudian dream symbolism does seem to work for me in my case. That I think Freud, I don't think that he was like an infallible oracle by any stretch of the imagination, but some of the stuff that he said seems to be pretty much right on. And a lot of his discussion of dream symbolism, like how water represents spirit, and like dreaming about a building is generally dreaming about your own body. And that was borne out by my father also, who said that after he got old, he started having dreams about being trapped in a dilapidated building that was falling apart. So it does, Freud seems to have been largely correct with regard to the meaning of dream symbolism, for example. And a lot of dreams are just kind of spam dreams. You know, you can just have weird dreams that don't mean necessarily much of anything. But I really do not have a thoroughly worked out theory of dreams. I'm not sure if anybody, I assume somebody has to have come up with some sort of elaborate, like very developed theory on dreams and, why we dream and the meanings of them and different purposes of dreams. Ram Dass, somebody asked Ram Dass once about, the importance of dreams in a spiritual life. And he says, for the most part, dreams are, you're working stuff out at other levels, at different levels of reality. Some of it is you're doing it in a dream state. And, sometimes you'll get information that is useful to you and you accept that, but for the most part, you shouldn't take it too seriously because a lot of it really is just like spam dreams and so forth. And it also reminds me of a weird idea that came from the Seth material. A woman named Jane Roberts, who was channeling this multidimensional being that called itself Seth. And Seth was saying that when you're dreaming, you actually are creating like a cruder level of samsara than this waking level. And that some of these people that you dream, that you can dream somebody that you've never met before. I had this one dream woman. She appeared in a number of my dreams when I was a young man. I don't think I ever met her in real life, but she appeared in like at least 4 memorable dreams that I was having like in my 20s and 30s. That these dream beings that you're creating in your dreams, that they can continue to have like an existence like away from you on their own. They're living in like this crude kind of ghost world, like a spirit world or something. So, in a way, we're creating our own universes, creating our own worlds in our sleep. I guess even a dog that's lying there kind of whimpering and jerking in its sleep is creating some kind of little fake dog world. In fact, I read somewhere that an American possum, the only marsupial that lives in the wild in the United States, Didelphis marsupialis, that they spend more time dreaming than awake. So they're creating these little murky possum spirit worlds of possums, like climbing into garbage cans and eating dog food off back porches and stuff. Anyways, I guess I should just move on to the next question. And we are kind of getting down towards the bottom. There's only a few more questions. So I think we're going to be under 3 hours. That's kind of good. So next question is from Harim Cthulhu. And Harim Cthulhu says, what happened to the Spiritual Right Project? Yeah, that was something that happened a few years ago. There was a number of people that were sort of contacted by the organizer and asked to get involved in this Spiritual Right Project. And I was willing. I'm generally, I don't initiate much, like with regard to interviews and so forth. But if someone asks me to participate in something, if it seems worthwhile, seems potentially like it might be a good thing, sometimes I'll go along with it. And so we made a few videos, and there was a lot of like private talk about, this like the trademark, or what do you call it? Like the avatar or something, what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And, what the rules were going to be. There was a lot of this kind of discussion, much more than actually creating videos. And the main problem was that the organizer, the person who was sort of coordinating this, whose idea it was, just kept changing his plans. And this is just kind of the sort of guy he he is. I think he's still this way, where he just would keep changing plans. It's like he'd lose interest in this and start wanting to do this instead, and then he'd be really gung-ho about that for a while, and then lose interest in that, or think that that's not going to work, let's try this instead. And people just started losing patience with it and dropping out, and the whole thing just kind of disintegrated. So that's what happened to that. And so I'm going to move on to the next question. And this is from Toronto Nat. And Toronto Nat says, I know your background is in Theravada, but maybe you can give me some of your spiritual insight on a personal situation. I am currently a member of an online Dzogchen Sangha, and I've generally been quite enjoying my time there. Unfortunately, I was recently confronted by a moderator for my alleged acts of Nazism, specifically for having a Discord profile picture with the black sun in it and talking about going to a Sam Hyde show. I was told that if I post something incriminating again, I would be asked to leave their Discord server. What would be your call if you were in my shoes? Well, I really don't even know who Sam Hyde is. I think I saw a picture of him just recently, but still, I don't know what Sam Hyde says in his talks or anything like that. Well, I guess if you're in this Dzogchen group that has like a Discord server, and the moderator there, or a moderator, very much doesn't like Nazi symbolism, then, I mean, you're just going to have to make the call for yourself. And which is more important to you? Being in that group, or like having a black sun on your Discord avatar? I mean, which is more important to you? And then you just have to decide which is more important and go with that. And it would be different for different people. I mean, if it were in my case, I probably wouldn't have a black sun on my Discord profile picture anyway. But then again, I probably wouldn't be on an online Dzogchen Sangha either. So, yeah, I mean, you're just going to have to decide which is more important. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily have to be dishonest in order not to be showing like what is perceived to be Nazi symbols or any kind of Nazi adjacent stuff. It all depends, like how leftist is the moderator. It's like just saying that like girls don't have a pee-pee like boys do. I mean, is that going to be like misogynistic, fascist Nazism? I mean, some people are kind of ideologically attuned with that kind of idea at present. So, yeah, I mean, what would be my call if I were in your shoes? I would have to decide which is more important. Just being like outspoken with regard to your political orientation, or being a member of the group. And which is more important to you? You're going to have to make that decision. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is the last question. And this is from David. And this was not under a Q&A video. This was under the video that I posted recently with my friend Brian, and I were discussing this new age idea of pre-life contracts. There's this idea that you'll decide what your next life is going to be like in advance. There's like a conscious decision from some like oversoul or something that I mentioned in the video that Ram Dass mentions in a book that he apparently believed this idea, where it's like, in order to work out my karma that needs to be worked out and make progress that needs to be made, I'm going to have to be born to like a 20-year-old black crack addicted prostitute, and with no father around, and just live in a just hand to mouth existence until I'm 23, and then get stabbed to death in a back alley. And okay, that's what I'm going to do. Let's do it. And Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism in particular, doesn't look at it that way. That there is there's not even a momentary gap between one life and the next. There is it's just an automatic process that your karma is just seeking its own path just through, almost mechanical means. It's like water just flowing in the direction that naturally it needs to flow. It's just working itself out without any kind of conscious decision making going on that is guiding that. It just happens whether you like it or not, whether you want it or not. It just happens naturally and automatically. That's the Theravada Buddhist point of view. So anyways, David says, why do you exclude the idea of contracts down to contracts with yourself to work karma out? It's possible that you make contracts with powerful entities for various reasons, both good and bad. People into black magic, for example, are known for making contracts with demons, but who's to say that you haven't made a pre-birth contract with a demigod like Thor, for example, that you would fight against the destruction of Europe? Who is to say Elon Musk didn't make a pre-birth contract that he would deliver agreed upon technological developments? Was Tesla being totally driven by his own genius, or was he trying to keep up his agreed upon contract? How much trouble do you get in if you die without completing your agreed upon contract? Well, how do you make this contract and when? Like, again, according to Theravada Buddhism, it's just one moment you die at the end of this life, the very next moment you are conceived in the next life. There is no time to be signing contracts. Just from the Theravada Buddhist point of view. With regard to making contracts when you're alive, like people into black magic are known to make contracts with demons, that is a worldly contract that you're making during this life. And that's not the kind of pre-life contracts that are being discussed. It's sort of like a bodhisattva vow could be considered a kind of contract where you're like postponing enlightenment indefinitely until all beings are liberated, this kind of thing. That, even if you make a bodhisattva vow in this life, then how are you going to know that you had made that bodhisattva vow in a subsequent existence? I may have made bodhisattva vows in previous lives. I don't recall them, and I haven't been following that vow very well, partly just because I'm really not the person that made the contract. And there is no oversoul from a Theravada Buddhist point of view that would be responsible for that sort of thing. So let's see. It's possible that you make contracts with powerful entities for various reasons, both good and bad. Yeah, well, that's really not the kind of contract that was being discussed in the video. What was being discussed in the video was more like what Ram Dass was saying, where it's like you decide that you're going to be living this kind of life, and it might be an unpleasant, horrible kind of life, but it's like some wiser aspect of you, your oversoul or whatever, just realizes that this is what needs to be done in order for you to make the most spiritual progress. And even though it's going to be excruciating for the ego, it's like the decision is made from a higher level than the ego that is willing to just damage parts of itself for the sake of achieving this higher goal. Sort of like, we're willing to get some damage on like our hands. We're working on a car or something, and we're willing to hit our knuckles against stuff accidentally. We're willing to take that risk, just for the sake of getting this car fixed. We're willing to take a little bit of damage doing mountain climbing or that sort of thing. You're willing to take a certain amount of damage to certain parts of your body. And the idea is like this oversoul is willing to let certain aspects of itself, lesser aspects like individual human lives, take damage for the sake of the benefit of the whole. And again, Theravada Buddhism doesn't go with that idea. Maybe some kinds of Hinduism do, because Ram Dass was more Hindu than anything else, and he endorsed it. And in New Age, a lot of people endorse it. But from the Theravada Buddhist point of view, there really is no oversoul to make these kinds of decisions. See, who's to say that you haven't made a pre-birth contract with a demigod like Thor? Well, it would have to be during your previous life, because from the Theravada Buddhist point of view, there is no gap in between one life and the next. There is no bardo realm where you're drifting around in some heaven realm making plans for the next life. Some Hindus believe that. Ram Dass, I remember in one of his books, he said, if it's your karma to be a prince in your next life, I mean, there might be a waiting list or something. It might take a while before that life is going to be ready for you to take it. And so you might wind up in some intermediate state. But in Theravada Buddhism, the intermediate state would itself be some kind of spirit existence. So it's just like you stop being a human, you start being this being in some other realm. And then after that, then you become the human prince or whatever. So let's see, who is to say Elon Musk didn't make a pre-birth contract that he would deliver agreed upon technology? I mean, who is he going to make the contract with? I mean, and how is he going to make this contract? I mean, who is to say that he did or didn't? I mean, whoever says or doesn't say it, I guess. So it just depends on how you look at it. And I mean, I'm open to the possibility of it. I do not think that Theravada Buddhism necessarily has, the final say on exactly how rebirth happens. And it may be that there is a kind of multidimensional oversoul kind of being, which is still illusory and samsaric. It's just like a higher level of samsara. It's just a higher level of illusion. Ultimately, none of it is like ultimately real. So how much trouble do you get in if you die without completing your agreed upon contract? I really don't think it works that way. And I did say it in the video that it's not that you make some conscious decision. So it's like somebody has this decision, they're going to be born to the drug addicted black prostitute and die when they're 23. It's not like they remember making that decision after they're born. And it's like, it's like your destiny. It's like you're not choosing some contract that you can possibly violate. You are choosing your fate. You're choosing your destiny, and it's going to happen whether you like it or not, whether you want to do it or not. It's still going to happen. I mean, that's the way it works in theory. It's not like you're sitting down writing, signing your name to a contract and then some notary stamps it, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, I kind of covered this information in the video with Brian, and I guess we're going to be making more videos. I haven't even uploaded all the videos I did with him last time. And then there might also be an aquarium video if I can get working on it before the timer makes it go into moonlight mode, because you got to have enough light that you can actually see Rama the First, the Siamese algae eater, doing his business in there, and so on and so forth. So, as I should always say at the beginning and almost never do, if you have any questions you think I can answer, and I mean, I'm not like an omniscient oracle, so there's a lot of things I really don't know much about, like the history of the Chinese prison system and so forth, who developed it and why. Or not Chinese, but Japanese, or what the Buddha was thinking, what he believed in before he became enlightened. I mean, I don't know how anybody can know that any more than they can know what Hercules was thinking. So if you think I can answer the question, or I think there's a good chance of it, especially with regard to Theravada Buddhism, early Buddhism, monasticism, meditation, Burma, me personally, that kind of thing. Maybe even throw in some biology stuff, because I know some stuff about biology, philosophy, religion in general. But the more obscure you get, the less likely it is that I'll be able to answer. But every once in a while, somebody will just hit the right chord and ask me some obscure question that I happen to have given a lot of thought about. So, hit the like button if you made it this far, I suppose. And subscribe if you haven't already. Check the URL links below the video. And try to stay off lists and be happy.